And just like that, the most decorated team in the Canadian Hockey League becomes just a little bit more decorated. A 10th Ontario Hockey League championship for the Peterborough Petes, who also, by the way, tend to go to the Memorial Cup final when they reach the final tournament. 6 times of their 9 times have the Petes reached the final game, but they've only won it once. So that's not the best part of the record, but 10 OHL championships for the Petes as we welcome you to this next episode of the OHL podcast. My name is Mike Farwell. That guy over there, Dan Mahar. No Owen Beck, no problem for the Petes, Dansky.
Yeah, I guess, eh? And first off, congratulations to Mike Oak, Rob Wilson, the whole Peterborough Petes franchise, obviously the players. What a performance this whole playoffs from that team. Like you said, it's that, I guess, next man up philosophy. And boy, were there some big performances in trying circumstances. And they always talk about if you're going to win, you have to face and beat adversity. And Peterborough sure can say they did that in this playoff run. And yeah, what a great job by them.
Boy, you talk about performances, and ours went south in a hurry when it came to predictions as the playoffs wore on. I started like a house on fire. I think I was 8 for 8 in the first round, and then we got the OHL final dead wrong. I had the Knights in 5, you had the Knights in 6, and I think it just speaks to it wasn't supposed to be this way, right? There was a lot of hand wringing, and I think understandably so in Peterborough when the Brennan Othman trade was made early, and it didn't seem to turn the team in the direction everybody thought it was going to turn. And I know we've documented this, so we don't have to keep going back over the old ground, but I'll just remind you one more time that this Pete's team was in a little bit, not it wasn't like neck and neck, but it was a little bit of a battle for even fourth place and home ice advantage coming into the playoffs. They end up as a 4 seed now, going all the way to and then winning the OHL title in 6 games.
Yeah, well, I guess when you go to those predictions for a second there, Mike, you being a Leaf fan, you came out of the gates hot and then blew it at the very end. Me being a Habs fan, I just blew it right away so I could enjoy the rest of my playoffs. But yeah, no, it was the thing with Peterborough Petes, and we've referenced this a bunch of times. And I swear to you, I had a number of people that follow the OHL carefully that told me that the Peterborough Petes are the best team and certainly the best top end and forward group. It's kind of hard to argue that, and that wasn't necessarily hindsight for those folks because they told me that before the playoffs. So I wasn't disagreeing with them so much as it was hard to see this happening based on the season they had, just consistently coming up a little bit short of what they should have, finishing fourth amongst four in those big four in the East in the regular season, and having to take down all those giants. You thought, I don't know, I started to have some doubts there, but again, that piece that gnawed at me at the back of my head, Mike, was always they were built for the playoffs. They were a team that was built for the playoffs. The back end was built for the playoffs, and we sure saw that, did we not?
You're reading my mind on that because I was going to say that very thing. As much as you like the top end talent and the firepower that was up front, for me, this OHL championship was defined by the blue line. And what else can you say too about Michael Simpson in goal?
Well, I mean, I don't know. We talk about these players, Mike, that were under the radar all year, and there was a few. I mean, we referenced Amadeus Lombardi and Flint, and there was a few of these guys all year that you just, these are amazing players that you just don't hear a whole lot about because they're overshadowed. Michael Simpson just did it all year. All year, he was there for that team. He was the backbone when they had these big games in the playoffs. He was not giving them anything. He wasn't giving them very many freebies. You talk about an under the radar player, and Michael Simpson was it for the Peterborough Petes all year.
Quick shout out to our friend Matt Smith, because Michael Simpson is a student of Matt Smith Goaltending, who's a good friend of this podcast for sure. And yeah, I mean, you look at guys on that Pete's roster. I loved Maye on the back end. I think Connor Smith goes without saying. I thought Cam Govro was a really interesting story this year, from North Bay to Saginaw, then over to Peterborough, obviously having to beat his former team in the East final. And I'll go back to what I had said and had long believed, contrary to what you said before, not disputing the people that were talking to you, but I thought North Bay was at least the most complete. Maybe didn't have the high octane offense that the Petes have shown themselves to have, but I thought the North Bay battalion. I almost said Centennials. We're the most complete team in the Eastern Conference for sure. But the Petes proved, I think, a lot of people wrong. And I just gotta I love it for the city. I really do. The last time of the 10 OHL championships the Peterborough Petes now have, the last one was 2006. That's a long time between titles for a really proud franchise. And of course, the last time they did it in '06, it was over these same London Knights. So if anybody has got the Knights number, maybe you can say it's the Peterborough Petes.
Yeah, and you know, Mike, you just referenced right off the top of that statement there a number of those players that impressed you. Maye, again, another unsung hero through that whole playoffs. But when you look at these championship teams, to win a championship, to win 4 series in your league and go to the Memorial Cup, the common thread about any of those teams is that you can pull out 10, 12, 15 names that just impressed you throughout the whole way. So it's a true team. You're not going to win on 1 or 2 players or 3 or 4 high-end guys. And I mean, how about Brian Zanetti? How about Gavin Waite added a little bit of the flair on the back end when you had a more stay-at-home group. We've already talked at length about Sean Spearing. I mean, you can have name after name out of that Peterborough lineup, and they all just brought it when it counted. And next man up, right? You had an injury or two, next man up, and just so impressed up and down that lineup.
You know, you mentioned an injury or two. We should talk at least for a moment about Owen Beck. I know not injured, but we started this episode of the OHL podcast by saying no Beck, no problem. Clearly, it turned out that way for the Petes, but a couple of things spring to mind for me in the suspension for the remainder of the series, which turned out to just be the one game for Owen Beck. It comes in the final minute of game number 5 that the London Knights won to make it a 6-game series with the Petes winning on home ice. But first of all, Beck maybe dodged a bullet earlier. I know we talked about this last week on the podcast. You didn't love the major that was assessed to him for head checking. So you were probably among the least surprised there was no suspension, but you're almost done for if there is a second transgression, which obviously there was. He gets the suspension. But the other thing I'm asking myself is what the HE double hockey sticks was Beck even doing out there in a 4-1 game in the final minute? It was over. Move on. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and you know, you like to give players like that the benefit of the doubt a couple times, but when it's the 3rd or 4th transgression of the year, really, I mean, he had a few reviewed majors this year, and that one I think he's got to wear. You're a really key player for your team, an NHL drafted player who's been really impressive year of hockey. Really, almost made the Habs out of camp. Got a game with them during the season. Was terrific as a last minute emergency addition to Team Canada over Christmas. Played a lot of hockey and just did nothing but impress. But if there's one blip on that radar, it's kind of left your team in a bit of lurch there, and right at the end of the championship series for, I'll just say it, kind of a bit of a bonehead move there. I mean, you got 30 some seconds left in a game that's over. You're just running out the clock there. You can't do anything stupid. And you know, it's kind of one of those heat of the battle. We've talked a lot about slew foots this year in the OHL and how it wasn't always the traditional slew foot, but just can't let that happen. So I'm sure Owen Beck is happier than anyone that Peterborough pulled out game 6, because had they gone down in that series, he was going to have a long summer.
Can I be so bold as to suggest that in a league where consistency is often asked for from the league, they were consistent, I would say pretty consistent anyway, on slew foots from day 1 to day end when Beck is getting that suspension in the final minute of game number 5 of the OHL final?
Yeah, you know, it's a great point, Mike, because we criticize the league a lot for consistency and other issues. And that's a great point, because when I look at all the slew foots that were called this year in the league, I mean, to be brutally honest with you, I don't love the standard they're using for slew foots. And even the back one, if you had asked me before the season, I said, that's kind of borderline. He didn't really kick out the legs from behind him. It was more kind of the leverage to the upper body. But when I look at the standard they set, it was clearly one, and it was clearly worse than a number that they had suspended for earlier. So when you talk about consistency, that's a great point. The league has set the standard, and it's hard for a player like Beck at this stage to argue he didn't know that was going to be a slew foot.
So a reminder, the Peterborough Petes have been to 9 Memorial Cups. 6 of those times they've been in the final game, but they've only won once. 1979, Bob Atwell had the Memorial Cup winning goal for the Petes. Former guest on this podcast. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Shameless plug. I know. Mike Martone, who scored an OHL championship winning goal in Game 7 versus Guelph on the road in that OHL final. Pete's Storm that went, the road team won every single game. And Martone, a former guest on this podcast. But I bring this up again just to remind you, 10 now OHL titles for the Petes, off to the Memorial Cup for that 10th time. They will play against, in the tournament, the host Kamloops Blazers, the Western Hockey League champion Seattle Thunderbirds, who ousted the Blazers in the Western Conference Championship. For what it's worth, the host Blazers gave the Thunderbirds their toughest test, at least in terms of games played, with 6 in that West final. Seattle then dispatches of the Winnipeg Ice in 5 games to earn the Memorial Cup berth and the Western Hockey League Championship. And Patrick Roy and the Quebec Rempart are the 4th team that will be in the tournament. So we've got Kamloops as host, Seattle as the Dub champs, Peterborough as the O champs, and Quebec as the Q champs.
Yeah, well, Mike, when you reference that 1 win in 9 attempts record for the Peterborough Petes, it's probably not the right time for me to mention to the folks of Peterborough that the Seattle Thunderbirds and Quebec Remparts exist, because for those that didn't follow those 2 leagues, the Quebec League, there were 4 teams, much like the Ontario Hockey League this year with a number of teams at the top in the arms race. There are 4 teams that really loaded up. And the team that emerged of those 4 was going to be a beast, and that was the Quebec Remparts. They dispatched some really high-end hockey teams. And then out west, if you want to talk the Seattle Thunderbirds, there were a couple scouts floating around the league this year that said the Seattle Thunderbirds might be able to beat some AHL teams. They were that good. So Peterborough, if you want to add a second Memorial Cup to your trophy case there, you're going to have to earn it.
I should note that I had forgotten until just earlier today. The head coach of the Seattle Thunderbirds is none other than Ontario Hockey League graduate Matt Odette. So there's an OHL connection there in Seattle.
Matt Odette, former Kitchener Ranger, and correct, I'm going off the top of my head. Did he not have a stint in Peterborough? I could be totally off base here.
Had a stint in the Sioux of all places, and then came back to Kitchener.
Sioux. Okay, sorry, I knew there was somewhere. Yeah, okay. So Matt Odette, who was a bruising blue liner, has turned into a stellar head coach, and yeah, so that's a little nostalgia there from the OHL.
All right. We would be remiss if we move on to some other topics in this podcast if we didn't at least talk about the London Knights. And for my money and from where I'm sitting, Dan, there are a couple of things to talk about. One that you brought forward earlier when we were discussing this episode, and that is, find me the last time a team went this far to an OHL final Game 6 with 3 different goaltenders, as the London Knights did.
Yeah, you'd be hard pressed. I think I certainly racked my brain to think of it, and injuries happen. So it's happened before where a starter has been lost, but when you have a starter the quality of Brett Brochu, who is really coming into his own the second half of this year, he goes down. They're calling on Zach Bowen, had some terrific games, had a little bit of a stumble. Then you turn to Owen Wilmore, and he was terrific in the last couple games. I mean, he did absolutely everything he could to pull that team through. So pretty remarkable for a team to be able to go 3 goaltenders deep and still get as far as London did. So definitely a tip of the cap to them on that.
All right. Let's talk a little bit more, because so this is going to come down to, it's such a bold move by Dale Hunter, I think, to go to Owen Wilmore. We'll get to more of that in just a moment, but Brett Brochu, let's not forget, like it's crazy when you think about it, but his first playoff series win came this season because he was knocked out a year before by the Kitchener Rangers in the first round. And then there was COVID the year before that. And 2 years before that, playoffs got wiped out. So his first playoff season or playoff series win was this year. And then he goes and posts 4 shutouts in 11 games, establishing, like, of all the goaltenders in London Knights history, Brett Brochu now currently owns the the record for most shutouts in a playoff series with 4. That's remarkable. You talked about Zach Bowen and his stumble. Yeah, he played well, but I think Dale Hunter's hand was maybe forced. An .872 win percentage just wasn't cutting it. And then to Owen Wilmore they go. Before we move on and talk about perhaps the boldness of that coaching decision and where it might tie into another storyline here, let me just say this also about the London Knights. And I'll just put it this way for you, Dan. Easton Cowan, Denver Barkey, Oliver Bonk. I'm even going to throw Sam Dickinson into the mix. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Players that are all going to be back for at least a couple years.
Right? And so exactly, you nailed it. And we did not plan that, I promise, but you nailed it because, and again, to go over some old ground here on the podcast, I was definitely among the people at the beginning of the season saying, where are the goals going to come from in London? This is going to be a little bit of a reset year. I know the London Knights don't rebuild, they reload. But where did this come from other than perhaps the style of play that Dale Hunter implemented? But nonetheless, this was supposed to be a reset year, arguably on paper, still was kind of a reset year for the London Knights. And now you've got a group like that who have only just begun in this league. So as much as, and I know there are 19 other fan bases who just became Peterborough Petes fans this week because the Petes knocked off the London Knights, the team that everybody loves to hate. Well, to the other 19 markets in this Ontario Hockey League, brace yourself because this core of the next London Knights has only just been assembled.
Yeah, that team that just lost in Game 6 of the league final was actually built for next year, folks. So, but yeah, you can't say enough about the skills development coaching for the London Knights because those players you referenced, Barkey and Cowan, and some of these players that come in a little bit relatively unknown, weren't tremendously high draft picks, but every one of them that comes through that London Knights system starts to become a producer over time. Some quicker than others, like those two I just mentioned, but they find ways to get the puck to the net and finish. And it's really that system that Dale Hunter has where they have the trap, they have the 1-2-2, and they're really hard to penetrate. They drive other teams nuts. So what ends up happening is other teams start taking some chances and start doing some things they're uncharacteristic, get out of their system to try and penetrate. And it affords the London Knights some opportunities. So you get those quick strike opportunities. And when you have quick feet and kids like Barkey and Cowan that can streak up ice and put it on net and hit the top corner as well as any of them, that's a system that works. And so you just got to credit the London Knights for continuing to develop and find that talent.
Okay, our performers of the week still to come on this episode of the OHL podcast. We answered the question, what is the job of a penalty box attendant anyway? And the former general manager of the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds is suddenly out of work. What does that mean? All of those things still to get to. So let's start right there, Dan. I'm being a little cheeky, of course, but the former general manager of the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds is none other than Kyle Dubas, who was released this past week by the Toronto Maple Leafs. They could not agree on a new contract. And now, look, I've heard this from more than one source, and by source I don't mean insider. It's just I've heard more than one person talking about this, and I think I get how you get there, but I don't know how you believe you should be there, if I can put it that way. So the latest rumor du jour is that Kyle Dubas will be replaced, and Sheldon Keefe presumably will be replaced in Toronto by the duo of Mark and Dale Hunter. I think you get there because you look at Brendan Shanahan and you ask yourself, where did Brendan Shanahan play his junior hockey? Oh, he played it in London. So there's a connection. I get it. So the next Shana plan would be with the guys that run the franchise that Shanahan once played for. Boom, the Hunters end up in Toronto to help the Leafs get to the promised land that the London Knights have clearly found in the Ontario Hockey League. So again, I get how you can make those connections, but even if you make them, I don't know how you try to pass them off as credible. To me, it's utterly preposterous. I have no inside intel, but I just can't make it make sense other than, sure, connect the dots, have some fun, but I can't see this happening.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mike. I've heard the same thing, same rumblings from a couple spots, and I don't believe it for a second either. Just I think there's way too much running in contrary to this story, but you can absolutely see where it comes from. We know Mark Hunter has interest in being an NHL GM again soon. We know that. We know he was kind of in the running for Calgary. We know he had some interest in some of these other openings, so he's open to it. Now, we know Dale is very unlikely to leave London anytime soon, but if he were, the only circumstances under which I could see him doing that would be to follow Mark, who is the GM, and preferably somewhere close-ish to home. So, hello, Toronto, hello, openings. So you can see where the links are made, and you just referenced Brendan Shanahan being a London Knight. Obviously, really tied into the success the Hunter brothers have had, and said, well, could they work their magic in Toronto? So you can start to connect some dots, but I've also heard an awful lot of other names in the mix from Toronto that sound a lot more credible from a lot more credible sources. But what a wild story that would be. Former London Knight fires former Sioux Greyhound to bring in two more Knights so who knows? But there are some definite intriguing OHL storyline potentials in Toronto this summer.
Obviously, Mark Hunter has already been a part of the front office for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He's no longer there. We know Dale left London for a minute and went and coached the Washington Capitals and had success. Had success with a team that others were saying nobody can have success with, and he did. But then he came right back to the Ontario Hockey League. That alone suggests to me that Dale Hunter. I agree with you on Mark, and I think the desire is still there to try his hand as a general manager in the National Hockey League. I don't think Dale wants to do anything other than become the winningest coach in the Ontario Hockey League history by a long shot. And I think if he wants to be that, he absolutely will be that. But interesting rumors anyway, just to finish the point on the Leafs, because as much as, and I'll tie it into the OHL this way, as much as the Ontario Hockey League is absolutely a stepping stone for players, for officials, you name it, to the next level, general managers, coaches, etc. I don't think the Toronto Maple Leafs are in a position right now to be looking at somebody that they're just going to break in, no matter how good they've been at the previous level. They're going to be looking for somebody, I believe anyway, with already National Hockey League experience or ties.
It certainly sounds like that's top of Shanahan's criteria list for his selection as new GM. So, but you could argue, obviously, Mark Hunter has a lot of that based on some of the experience he's had since leaving the playing world. But yeah, the Dale Hunter bit, he's got quite a legacy in the OHL, like you said, building towards the career all-time win record. 63 years old. Does he really have anything to prove? Would he want to have potentially tarnish his reputation by that hot seat in Toronto? But you have to figure at some point he's going to want to get out of the way of his son Dylan in London and turn over the reins. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes, but it's definitely one of those things, Mike, like you said, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that, but some interesting storylines to watch for sure. Okay, did Gord Lowe's just become the most famous penalty box attendant in the history of hockey? I won't even say just in the history of the Ontario Hockey League, but game number 4, Pete's Knights in Peterborough, Ryan Winterton gets sent to the penalty, but no, it was Humphrey, right? So pardon me, it was Humphrey. Yeah. I knew it was one of the rides. It was so Ryan Humphrey gets sent to the penalty box, and for reasons I can't explain, penalty box attendant Gord Lowe's engages an already irate Ryan Humphrey, and it didn't take a genius to read the lips, especially of Ryan Humphrey with what he said to Gordy Lowe's. I'm trying to make it all make sense, but what's your take on the penalty box attendant engaging with a player like that?
You know, I obviously don't love the optics. I mean, all I have to go on is the short video we saw, and it looked to me like a little over zealous penalty box attendant, not happy with something that was going on in the heat of the moment and maybe overstepped a little there. I know friend of the podcast, Ryan Payette, had a good article where he talked to the league about it, and the league VP Ted Baker had to say that he felt that both parties acquitted themselves quite well, that the penalty box attendant's job there is to follow protocol and knows when to close the door and create a safe environment. And he was not happy with the actions of the player, let him know it, but they worked it out. They're buddies in the end. So that's kind of what Ted Baker said about the whole thing. So maybe it's much ado about nothing, but certainly the optics were, maybe chill out a little here, just open and close the door, leave the players be.
They're definitely buddies in the end, as described by Gord Lowe's himself during an in-game interview during Game 6 in Peterborough. I wrote down a couple of quotes. "This is what hockey's all about," said Gord. "You can be mad for 1 minute and away you go again. It was a hockey moment that went bad for 30 seconds." And then he proceeded to talk about how he went to see Humphreys before the game in Peterborough. The London Knights were high-fiving him, etc. So yes, definitely a happy ending. And even that short video that went viral, you could see Humphrey and Lowe's were fine with one another by the time that penalty ended. But listen, I'm not here to pick on anybody or beat on anybody, but to the point you made a moment ago, Dan, as the penalty box attendant, you have a job. It's to keep that environment safe. It's to open the door, to close the door. I and Gord explained in his in-game interview during Game 6 that Humphreys was so upset that he wanted to make sure that he didn't go back out onto the ice and get himself into more trouble and maybe earn a suspension or something like that. Respectfully to Gord Lowe's, I don't know him at all, but respectfully, it's not your job. Like, again, your job, keep that environment safe for the player, open the door, close the door. I'm sure penalty box attendants and timekeepers with those spaces in between the penalty boxes have heard all kinds of things over the years. You just got to keep a lid on it, stare straight ahead, and do your job. I just don't know why Gord in this case decided to engage, but I'm glad it had a happy ending, and I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, well, I think if you've ever read some of the memoirs, I guess, of players from the NHL that frequented the penalty box, they talk about all the relationships they built with the attendants over the years and how some of them are still friends. So there is a little bit of I'm sure, a relationship built there over time with some of the players. This case, I'm not sure it's it. It just reminds me of that for the older crowd here, Farwell, that Seinfeld episode where Kramer was a ball boy at the U.S. Open and collided with the player. It's like sometimes when you're an official or an attendant of any kind, the last thing you want to do is interact with the players during the course of the game in any way that brings yourself into the spotlight. Just do your job.
Who would have thunk it, eh? Of all the storylines, minor as it is, to emerge from an OHL final, we've got Gord Lowe's penalty box attendant.
Got to get your piece of the pie there, Mike. Got to get your 15 minutes of fame there. So
All right, as we move into the Memorial Cup round robin and ultimately a Canadian Hockey League champion, I guess we've got one more crack at this performer of the week, Dan. So who's the last one you have on your radar as we wrap up this portion of our OHL podcast?
all right, Mike. Well, I'm going to go a little unprecedented here because there was a lot of options. Let's face it. I could rhyme you off the top of my head 15 names I think were deserving, but the unprecedented part, Mike, because I think I'm going to do what I probably shouldn't be doing, is I'm going to go with the same guy twice in a row, and that is Tucker Robertson. And I'm going to tell you why. There's some obvious reasons. Goal and assist in a 2-1 championship winning game, Game 6. But really what put it over the top for me was you had Owen Beck suspended, your face-off specialist. You walk into Game 6 and they tell Tucker Robertson in a deciding game, you have to take 37 faceoffs in the absence of your faceoff specialist, and he won 26 of them, on top of scoring the goal and assist, by the way, in a 2-1 win. So I think that is just the type of performance in a clinching game that says you couldn't possibly have impacted the game more as a single player. So I'm going unprecedented, Mike, and I'm giving another nod to our friend Tucker Robertson for just a beastly performance in the win.
It's an excellent choice. I had him on my mind too, but I'm like, wow, crap. Mahar just picked him last week. I'll let it go. I was taking a look at Connor Lockhart. I think for obvious reasons, stats aside, what a nice story it is. An off-season acquisition, plays the entire year with the Peterborough Petes. It's his OHL swan song, and he's off to the Memorial Cup. Hard to not like that story. Michael Simpson, I think, would be another obvious choice here. Had a bit of a hiccup in game number 2, but really was terrific. And we've already talked about him on the podcast. But I'm going in a slightly, just an ever so slightly different direction as well. And I'm going to go with J.R. Avon in this one. He scored twice in the game that gave the Petes a 3-1 series lead. He's got an assist as well. But over and above that, over the past 3 games since the last time we had an episode of the OHL podcast, 18 shots on goal, 5, and then 8 more in game number 6, though he didn't register a point. But that just shows me a guy that's in key places, putting pucks on net. How many times have we said in the history of hockey, throw the puck at the net and good things will happen? So I'm going to give J.R. Avon with his 2 goals, 1 assist, and 18 shots on goal over 3 games. My nod as performer of the week. And hey, it doesn't hurt if your stepdad is Steve Larmer. So I'll just throw that in there as well.
Well, if you need verification, Mike, that's a great pick. I actually had 3 runners up this week, and they were Michael Simpson, Avery Hayes, and J.R. Avon. And I think all 8 of JR's shots tonight came in the first half of that game too. So you talk about setting the tempo and setting the pace and trying to make up for a loss of a couple key players in that lineup. But J.R. Avon just showed up every night quietly and did his job. So another great choice.
All right. So we are headed into Memorial Cup time. Can the Peterborough Petes get to another final and make it 7 Memorial Cup finals appearances in 10 Memorial Cups? But more than anything, since 1979, we're talking, 44 years. Can they actually win a second Memorial Cup in franchise history? I guess it remains to be seen, but we'll keep breaking it down as the tournament gets underway.
Yeah, and I think as OHL fans, Mike, we all turn to Peterborough fans now when you head to the Memorial Cup. That's the way it should be. You root for the OHL team and represent well. And best of luck to the crew from Peterborough. And like I mentioned earlier, you're gonna hoist it. You're gonna earn it this year with who's at that tournament. So best of luck to Peterborough.
Can I just add? I can't believe I forgot earlier because I put it in my mind. See, if I don't write it down, I forget. But I wanted to mention, and I say this as a guy that grew up in Kitchener, has been a lifelong Kitchener Rangers fan, and now is fortunate enough to broadcast their games on radio. But ever since I was a kid, and it remains true to this day, I'm sorry to the quote unquote blue shirts. I love the Rangers jersey with the exception of the cartoon cowboy that they brought back as a retro this year. Forget that. I wish we could forget that whole half of the 90s. Anyway, Peterborough Petes, for my money, hands down, best unis in the league. Hands down.
I'm not gonna argue with you. I think they're terrific unis. They're classic. They're old school. They're unique. Yeah, I'm not gonna argue on that one.
All right, let's look ahead to Friday's feature interview. Is it too much of a hint if I say, because we just talked about one of our guys that was in the mix for Performer of the Week in Connor Lockhart. So they played for the same team, but not at the same time. I'm really putting you on the right track here for sure. If you can connect that dot, shouldn't be too hard. Was in the Montreal Canadiens organization with the Hamilton Bulldogs before they were an OHL team, still in the AHL. And I think the best part of his story entirely was the night he was called upon to don the goalie equipment and play goal. He's a forward, except for that one memorable game. So there is your guest for your feature interview on Friday's episode of the OHL podcast.
I know exactly who that is, and it's quite a character.
That guy over there is Dan Mahar. He's a character too. He called Ryan Payette a friend of this podcast. You'll find Dan on Twitter at Dan Mahar. My name is Mike Farwell at Farwell_OHL. Hey, are you sending Payette anything as condolences now that the OHL championship is over? Your buddy over there?
Okay, he's friend of half the podcast. Can we say that?
You can email us anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Feature interview with the guy that once played goal coming up on Friday. Thanks for listening to the OHL podcast.